Welcome back to our second day of Advocacy Camp. We've got folks filtering in, so while we're just giving folks 1 or 2 more minutes to come in out of the waiting room, why don't you go ahead and say hello in the chat, just so we get a sense of who is here. Scarlett, would you like to start us off with a land acknowledgement?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. Virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. I'm at home in Worcester, Massachusetts, homelands of the Nipmuc Nation people and their allied tribes, past and present. NEMA recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society, which continues the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout New England and beyond. You can use the Indigenous Peoples land map to locate the lands where you're zooming in from this morning, or where your museum is located. I'm going to drop it in the chat here. And thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Meg.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's introducing yourselves in the chat. It's wonderful to see both some familiar faces and also a lot of folks joining us from out of region. So hello to all of you inside and also outside New England this morning. And special thanks to those of you who are in very early morning time zones at present for taking the extra time to come join us to talk about advocacy and geek out a little bit, because this stuff is really fun for me. So having this many people in a room willing to talk advocacy with me is super exciting. All right, so I will go ahead and let Brooke introduce herself, my excellent co-presenter.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I also love advocacy and geek out with Meg on it. So it's great to see so many people joining us today. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I have been working in museums for over 20 years, primarily art museums, and most recently the MFA, Boston. I'm also on the NEMA board, and I've been doing advocacy since about 2016, both in DC with AAM and NEMA, and then locally on the state level with NEMA folks. I teach a course at Northeastern called Building Value Within Cultural Organizations, and advocacy is definitely a focus within that, and creating impact statements to communicate your value. Currently, I'm at Brigham and Women's Hospital as the Director of Visual Arts Education. And in that work, I have to advocate quite frequently for the arts and communicate the value of arts within healthcare. So I'm going to thank Meg for inviting me today. As I said, she and I have been partners in this work for a while, and I'm happy to be here with all of you.
It's true. You and I are pretty much advocacy buddies of the same generation. So yes, my name is Meg Winnicates. I'm the Director of Engagement for the New England Museum Association. Thank you again for joining us all today. And we are going to be talking about writing and using impact statements for advocacy. So what exactly is an impact statement? Who is it for? And why do you go to the bother of using one? That's, or more than one, because we have big ambitions for today. So impact statements generally are a way to frame the most important supporting evidence for whatever ask you're making of a public official, their staff, a granting foundation, etc. So an impact statement basically takes some of your best stories and puts it into a nice, condensed, readable, visually appealing thing that you can leave behind at a visit and say, here's what our organization is about and why we need your support. Usually it's got a call to action on the bottom, which will tell people like, and here is what we need from you. And you can use impact statements or pieces of your impact statements in a lot of different ways. And we'll get into that at the very end, but very briefly, we will mostly be talking about how you use this with your elected officials, but you can also be using this kind of information in your annual report for your members or your board or your supporters or your donors. You can be using some of this information in both grant applications and grant reports. You can be using this as part of a press release, as part of your media relations planning. So impact statements are a really key tool for advocacy, but they have a very wide potential audience, and they only require a little tweak here and there depending on who it is you're trying to get the information across to.
Yeah, and so who do you share them with is another sort of part of that. And as Meg said, a really wide audience. You can share them with legislators, town leaders, donors, foundations, granting agencies, your peers, also your members of your museum, and they can be part of social media or public awareness presence. You can also keep them as sort of use them as a record of what you've done and what you've accomplished over the years. So they can be really helpful resources in many ways.
So we're going to go through 4 different examples of kinds of impact statements today. We are going to be looking at the 2 that are most common and recognized in the field thus far, which are economic and educational impact statements. Then here at NEMA, we've generated templates for 2 new kinds of statements reflecting on the kinds of major issues that museums are grappling with and working on at present. So we're going to also be talking about environmental impact statements and equity-centered impact statements, and we'll go through the key pieces of each of these things. And if you're looking for some examples from outside the museum field, which I actually really recommend, I would say the libraries do it best. Libraries are, and librarians and people who love libraries are incredible advocates for the value of libraries. And they have some phenomenal pieces of advocacy material that I highly recommend you check out. So I've got a couple of them here on the slide. The one that I was talking about yesterday, for those of you who were in our Intro to Museums Advocacy session, is the because statement. Because 5 out of 5 doctors agree reading aloud to children supports brain development. Therefore, you should support libraries. They are really, really good at that. They have so many because statements. I think they've got like 50 posters you can print out. We should do that for museums, and I'm recruiting all of you to help me. And so there are other good national sources that have good advocacy materials as well. Americans for the Arts, theirs is also very data heavy, which can be really helpful. And they've got statewide information as well as national level information. Aztec, Association for Science and Technology Centers, the American Historical Association, they all come at it from slightly different angles depending on what their background is, but all resources worth looking at and all linked from the NEMA Advocacy Resource Library. It's also important to not get too overwhelmed when you get started, because you already have a lot of the information that you're going to need to put an impact statement together. So you may already have gathered a bunch of the things that you're going to want to put in your impact statement for things like annual reports, annual appeals, any kind of reporting that you're doing to granting organizations, anything that you could pull from visitor evaluations, feedback forms from schools, surveys, admissions data, cute letters and thank yous from kids who've come on school field trips. Lots of good possibilities that you can incorporate into your impact statement when you're gathering data. And then when you're looking for context, which I think is a key piece that sometimes people don't include when they do their impact statement, when you're looking for context, you can be looking to people like NEMA and other professional service organizations, state and local tourism offices, Main Street collaboratives, et cetera, that will give you some of the, and here's where we fit in the larger picture of the museum community, our town, the nonprofit industry, et cetera. So there are, again, several of those kinds of things are linked on our website, though obviously you know better than we do how to get to your local tourism offices and Main Streets collaboratives, et cetera. So again, you have a lot of this information and some of it is very easy to find. And it's also important to think about treating these as essentially a persuasive argument on a piece of paper. So you're saying, this is an issue, this is how we are dealing with this issue, and this is what we need from you in order to be able to do it better. That's like the key framing for any impact statement. And now we'll go into some specifics around each of the individual sorts. So Brooke, up to you.
So I'm gonna, if you can actually just go back a slide.
Of course.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you today about economic impact statements and educational impact statements. They are sort of the original impact statement, and then Meg is going to add some great new ones. So in terms of an economic impact statement, I think a good thing to remember is that after the 2016 election, especially, we realized that we could no longer trust that our work was inherently valuable, and that we needed to make a clear and compelling case for the importance of museums. Tim Delaney, who is the CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits, said at 1 a.m. Advocacy Day, "If you are not on the table, you are on the menu," which was something that really stuck with me. And so enter advocacy, and it really becomes now a part of the job of museum staff. And starting with economic impact statements can really show museums as anchors to their communities. Where there are museums and cultural institutions, people spend more time, which means they eat out more, they stay overnight, they shop, and they're likely to return in the future or recommend it to friends and families. So the purpose of the economic impact statement is to communicate the various ways your organization contributes to the economy of your community, your region, and your state. So next slide, please. So some key questions to think about when you're crafting this economic impact statement is, why does your museum matter? How do you let others know it matters? What unique services do you provide? What would be the impact to your community if the museum closed? And how do your contributions compare to state or national trends? You want to think of both qualitative and quantitative information to kind of paint that picture about your museum, and think about, I think, especially in light of COVID, everything that your museum has contributed to the community that you're in can be part of that as well. So next slide, please. So here are some context and resources, a great list that Meg has put together, things that you can look at to kind of pull some information from, and get a sense of what would be good to include within your economic impact statement. I would also add another resource if you're interested in kind of reading more about the contributions of museums to community. There is a book called Cities, Museums, and Soft Power by Gail Lord and Blankenberg. And it's a good reading about sort of the impact of museums in a particular area, and what it might look like if those museums weren't there. So next slide, please. So here is kind of a template of what to include, and on the right is an example of what it can look like. So things you want to think about are direct and indirect employment. So who are your staff, but then also who are the consultants that you might employ, who are the contractors that you might employ. All of that is contributing to the economic impact of your museum on a particular community. What are the benefits to local businesses? As I said, when people are coming to visit your museum, they might not necessarily just be coming to your museum, but also visiting other organizations and companies within the area. So what does that look like? Your payroll taxes that are paid to the state is another way that you're contributing to the community and to the state. Also, the value of the services that you provide, from free admission to student programs, civil services. I remember one program, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston did a food pantry during COVID, and that really contributed to their community and helped out their community during that time. So thinking about things like that, special things that your museum has done to make an impact. Always getting powerful quotes from partners or return visitors can help. And then looking at local versus state versus national, and finding a way to sort of summarize your main points. We're going to talk later about the design of these templates and these statements. And so really having a clear point that you want people to take away can be really helpful, especially for very busy people like legislators that only have a couple minutes to read your statement. All right, so moving on to education. So education is a core value area of museums. It's part of the mission of the organization. It's the area that most people recognize as the role of museums, and also maybe how many of the people you are advocating to have connected with museums, either on a personal level or through bringing friends and family, bringing their kids to enjoy an exhibition. So it can be an easy entry to connect with your audience when advocating. It's also a way to expand people's thinking about what education in museum includes. I think a lot of people, at least in my experience, assumed I was teaching K through 12 when I was working in museums, and I was primarily working with adults. And they were sort of surprised by some of the programs that I was doing. So thinking about ways to really promote all the interesting things that you're doing within your museum, and highlighting those unique programs and the impact on audiences. Next slide, please. So some key questions that you can ask here or answer here and provide. What are the number of students and the ages, the school systems or the towns served? And as we say here, the pro tip is think of it by congressional district. So all advocating is focused on the local, and you want to make sure you're making that connection with the person that you're talking to and their constituents. Thinking about free or reduced admission, the range of visitation from the general public to any people that you might get who are coming in as tourists. Think about sort of all the zip codes and all the areas that you are impacting. Any flagship programs, as I mentioned, what are sort of unique, interesting programs that your museum is doing that other museums might not be doing, and how do you highlight that? Also, what needs are you filling? What holes in the curricula are you able to fill in your museum, and critical skills that you're supporting for your local students? Again, I would go back to COVID. I think museums have done some amazing things and pivoted, to use the word of the day, to how they can really help families during this challenging time. So what digital resources did you create? What did you do to really help people get through the pandemic with resources from your museum? Next slide, please. So again, here are some great resources that Meg has put together, focusing on information that you can pull for impact statements and for advocacy. I would just again highlight that you want to look at resources within your local state or district, and focus on how you're impacting that area, so that you can make the most of your argument to your legislator. Next slide. And then another example of a template. So pictures are always amazing to have. The more pictures, the better. I think it really tells that wonderful, gripping sort of visual story. Quotes from people who participated in your program, statistics, again, going to how many people attended a program, and then what value is your organization contributing within education? How do you serve your community, and what would be lost if you weren't there? And then you can also add a call to action for your legislators in relation to education. So I'm going to turn it over to Meg to talk about our next two.
Thanks very much, Brooke. That was fabulous. And I have been able to see people furiously scribbling notes while you've been talking. So many thanks for all of the pro tips you've been giving out there. And as a reminder to everyone, a lot of what we've been talking about is in the downloadable toolkit that I linked earlier in the chat. So many of the things we're talking about are listed in there if you want to be able to go back and read through it again. Also, this is being recorded, so you are more than welcome to come back and have another listen, because we know we're throwing an awful lot of information at you right now. All right, moving on, environmental impact statements. So this one is a new one based around the fact that really we're recognizing that as climate change is becoming an unavoidable issue to discuss and to deal with in museums, it's really important to be talking to our public officials and to the general public about what museums are doing in order to try to combat climate change, and also how museums are negatively impacted by climate change, because we're hoping to get people to care one way or the other. Either they're saying, good job, keep going, here are some tools and some money to help you do what you need to do, or gee, we really love this institution, and if you're at threat, then we need to be pressuring our public officials to be doing more against climate change, et cetera. So key questions to be thinking about when you're talking about an environmental impact statement is to think about, what is your institution's commitment to climate change? And that can be in terms of thinking about what kinds of education are you doing for the general public? What kinds of facilities updates or mitigation work are you doing? What kind of, and that's things like, how are you making your site more green in terms of using less energy or creating less waste, other things like that, reducing your carbon footprint overall. Thinking about things like, what are you doing for resiliency? So if you are a museum in a flood zone near a river or a harbor, if you are highly impacted by extreme changes in weather. In New England, not only is flooding a major issue, but extreme precipitation has already been a really noticeable impact. So, you know, where you are elsewhere in the country, it may be drought and extreme temperature fluctuations. There are lots of different ways in which, say, your collections might be impacted and what you're trying to do in order to deal with that, et cetera. Think about which are the things you're most concerned about that you want people to know, and how can we do more, and what do we need to do it? You know, whether we're talking about tax incentives or what they call direct pay incentives, where it's essentially like granting or an interest-free loan or a forgivable loan, like a lot of the things that they were doing for COVID relief, where it's like, if you're using this money in order to be able to put solar panels on your institution, if you're not a historic house and not allowed to do that sort of thing, then, you know, here's a bucket of money for nonprofits and museums and cultural facilities to be able to access for that kind of thing. So we put together a lot of information to help people who are getting started with this kind of work, and that's all located on our website under the Green Museum's Finding Aid in our Advocacy Resources section. So I put together the entire finding aid, and I think everything in it is useful, but again, slightly overwhelming when you're just getting started. So I was talking to one of the other members of our advocacy committee, and her favorites from the list that she's wanted us to highlight are the Culture for Climate recording, the link to the organization Sustainable Museums, which is now called Climate and Culture Partners. And they are actually doing an entire IMLS grant with us, where we're working with museums to study what their environmental impact is and be putting out information about how other museums can also be reducing their environmental impact. The Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice, and the UN Climate Change Calculator. So those were some of the ones that she found most useful and thought you would as well. And then again, here we go with the environmental template that we created, where the things that you most want to call out are, what are you doing to help? What more can you do? How are you currently being impacted? And how can legislators help you do what you're doing better? So I'm just going to pull it up larger so people can see it a little better. So thinking about, what are the costs to your site? Legislators care about things like, how much money is it costing you in, say, insurance costs, and how much money do you stand to save by installing some of these resiliency measures? Because they're looking at things like disaster relief costs. And if we don't have to send FEMA to your site, how much money can we save? And other things like, what kinds of innovative ways are you trying to mitigate your extended impact? Because museums are part of the tourism industry. And as we all know, there are a lot of carbon costs thanks to tourism. Are you encouraging people to, say, bike ride or take public transportation to your site? Do you have some kind of like discount for people who show you their bus ticket or whatever in order to get there? You know, do you have permeable paving in your parking lot to reduce runoff and improve the groundwater levels? Do you have hiking trails that you maintain on your site? You know, what are the things that you're doing to promote green living in your community entirely and mitigate sort of some of the systems that we're part of, et cetera? Okay, and Amherst has a question about the templates, and I will get back to that when we get to design. The short answer is I did all of these in Canva, and I'll be talking more about that later. So I used some of Canva's existing templates, and then I tweaked them a ton. So if anybody wants these specific layouts, you can email me and we can figure out how to share that file with you. Otherwise, you can go on Canva and tweak it for yourself, and we'll get back to design tips shortly. One of the other things that is really helpful is this thinking about sort of circles of influence, which is the scope 1, 2, and 3. So thinking about scope 1 is your immediate impact, like what kind of HVAC system do you have and that kind of thing. And then scope 2 is moving out wider, like where do you buy your energy from? Are you getting energy from, a coal-fired energy plant, or are you getting your energy from doing one of those like buy solar kinds of programs? And then scope 3 is again thinking about that wider impact of sort of all of the people who are coming to your space, and what are you doing to encourage like a change in behavior that's not technically in your control, but you have a certain level of influence. And that's actually a place where museums can make a huge amount of difference through some of the kinds of things that I was talking about. And again, calls to action for this one can be a little fuzzy. There are a lot of bills in the Senate and the House at the federal level right now that are tangentially related to museums, where we might stand to benefit if they pass, and but none of them are specifically directed at museums. So the kinds of things that we could be asking for at both, say, a state and a federal level are things about funding for mass transit to try to get cars off the road and more people taking public transportation. Ask them to be sharing climate solutions with their constituents, rebate programs for clean energy equipment, direct pay programs and grant funding as opposed to tax incentives, because of course, as nonprofits, there are a lot of forms of tax incentives that we don't qualify because we're not paying those taxes in the first place. And they may not be thinking about that, because a lot of the solutions right now in terms of trying to convince people to do more green construction, et cetera, tend to come in the forms of tax incentives that we can't tap into. And then thinking about ways that public officials might be able to help connect us to people who are working in that area, or that we might be able to help connect legislators and whatnot to the partnerships that we're already a part of. So that is the environment. Thank you, Heather, for sharing my email. I appreciate it. Okay, so again, moving on to equity-centered. This is another new, different angle than what we're suggesting, and that is totally fine, but we think this is a discussion that should be happening in the field and that should be shared with the wider universe of public policy, et cetera. So this is thinking about how your organization relates to your broader community and what you're doing in order to try to be a more inclusive and representative space, and ways that your organization can contribute to equity in the wider world. So this is a really, really key point where you need to be providing your community context, because otherwise this stuff is just existing in a bubble, and it's really hard to talk about impact. It's very hard to measure impact in this particular area. And so particularly for people who have organizations in communities that historically don't have a lot of immigration, or that are historically extremely white, et cetera, sometimes they look at something like this and they think, oh gosh, I have nothing to say. But that's not true. And there's something in here for everybody, because we can all be working on this. So, but again, that's why context matters, because where you are really determines what kinds of impacts you're looking at. So common equity markers include things like, how much access to public transportation is there near your organization? And are you located in or near places like food deserts? What's the percentage of the population that's school age that qualifies for free or reduced lunch programs? A lot of that kind of information is available from your state government, and also from the federal census. So you can be looking some of that up, like based on your zip code and things like that, and get a lot of that information to help you figure out where you fit in the broader picture. And then in terms of what's going on at your organization, think about who are you including at what levels, you know, how many levels of staffing do you have based on the size of your organization, who's on your board, who's involved in other kinds of advisory committees, when do they get involved in the process? There's been lots of conversation in the museum field about, say, making sure that you get people involved in an exhibit planning process earlier rather than later, that kind of thing. All of those things make a difference. Thinking about who's in a decision-making role and whose voices are represented and who's missing. Now, you're not necessarily writing down who's missing on your impact statement, but those are questions to be considering as you're assembling your information. Thinking again, as with education, what's your organization doing that nobody else in your area is doing? What are you doing really, really well? And what community needs are you addressing? So all of those are the kinds of things to be thinking about. Places to find context, mentioned the census already. Sometimes states have equity dashboards. Massachusetts has a really good example, the Massachusetts Health Equity Dashboard, which can give you some examples of the kinds of information to go looking for in your own states. That's where I got a lot of the information about things like food deserts and mass transit and access to healthcare, how many people are insured in your area, all of that kind of stuff. Who has access to high-speed internet, all of those kinds of things. And if you can't find that information, remember those libraries who are excellent advocates that I've talked about, they may very well have some of that information or know where you should look for it. So give them a call, because they would probably be really happy to help you with a project like this. Artists Thrive has a great sort of rubric for evaluating where do we fall on the realm of supporting. They're specifically talking about arts and culture workers, but you can think about it more broadly as well in terms of sort of where are we supporting the populations we claim that we want to be supporting and including. And Americans for the Arts also has this incredible Arts and Social Impact Explorer with tons of information in it. So I recommend checking that out as well. Even if you're only tangentially related to the arts, a lot of the information there is equally relevant if you're a history or a science organization or a children's museum. So here's my equity template. Again, one more time, I will pull that up a little larger for people to be able to see. Some of the key things that you may have noticed that are appearing on all of these templates are things like making sure you have your contact information and also put a publication date on it, because timely information is super important. You want to use whatever the most up-to-date information is, because people don't really want to hear what your economic impact was from 2015 because no longer relevant. You know, you can say pre-COVID, here's where we were and here's what COVID's impact has been, and we are, you know, working forwards to XYZ, but try to keep it timely. So again, this is a situation where, kind of like with environmental impact, where some of these things can be hard to measure, you want to look at intent and sort of the amount of energy you're putting into something. So thinking about, like, what's your commitment to this without necessarily trying to measure the outcome, because some of these outcomes are incredibly gradual and are not yet measurable, and that's okay. As with education, where you have quotes from community members and things like that, that's always really valuable, especially if they're constituents of the people you're talking to. All politics is local. And this is another place where there can be a call to action depending on what's going on at the level you're talking about. There may be something happening in your state, there may be something happening at the federal level, but thinking about funding, granting, visibility, sharing any resources that you have with their constituents. A lot of times museums are doing amazing programs that have to do with, you know, helping families reconnect with family members who have been incarcerated, or they have programs around support for people who are recent immigrants that are sort of citizenship programs or language literacy programs or things like that. And, you know, one of the major things that you can ask your officials to do is, like, share that we have these services with your constituents. It's not always we need this from you, but we have this to offer. That can also be a call to action. Thank you, Ambrose. Just dropping all kinds of interesting Connecticut information in the chat there. So I hope at least some of you in the audience are from Connecticut. All right. Rhode Island also has a new Civic health index that someone shared with me yesterday. So I think that was Heather. Thank you for that. All right, on to design tips.
Yeah. So I would argue that something we're very good at in the museum field is communicating with one another and communicating with our audience. So when you're thinking about designing these, think about what do you want someone to know and understand when they're done reading. You can think about it like an exhibit process or designing an educational program. What are the 1 to 3 main ideas that you want people to understand and take away, and then have everything sort of point towards those and really highlighting those. You're going to use your headings and your images and your captions to reinforce those core messages. So as you can see here, what's really important, the first 2 bullet points are visual. So photos, infographics, what is some visual information that's going to be engaging, that's going to really catch the eye of your audience and tell a story. You'll also want to think about, as we talked about in some of the other impact statements, any quotes that you might have, and share those with people. You can present information through bullet points or timelines or maps. Think of a way to make the information easily digestible, as the slide says, and really not overly crowded. You don't want to put too much information on there because it's just going to be overwhelming for your reader. So what can someone learn about your organization quickly and easily? Also, what's quotable, what is memorable for them. So when they're going back and they're talking to other people, they can share that information. Often when you're advocating, you're talking to congressional aides. You're not actually talking to your senator or your representative. So how can you present the information that those aides can easily bring it back to their bosses? You really want to paint a picture of your organization with this information, as you can see here from the 2 examples on the slide. Turn it over to Meg.
All right, and here are a couple of examples that I pulled. There's a good set of examples that are on AAM's website under their advocacy resources that are available to download to have a look at. So these are some of the ones that I feel like show 2 very different approaches, but equally effective. And you can tell a little bit about sort of what's most important to each of these museums by how they present the information. So some of them a little more text, some of them a few more pictures, thinking about the Illinois State Museum actually has multiple locations to try to represent. So they're doing kind of bullet points by location. Amon Carter has some really great engaging pictures of people doing stuff and some very large, impressive numbers that kind of stand all on their own, but you can see that they've made those numbers really big. So they're very eye-catching. So all of those are really nicely done. It is really tempting because you are an expert in your subject. You know more about your museum than anybody else. And I have been prey to this too. Everything feels really important to try to convey, and it isn't. So try to avoid having massive paragraphs because that tends to make people's eyes glaze over. And as Brooke said, oftentimes if you're doing this as part of a visit, if you haven't sent the information to them ahead of time, then they're glancing at it while you're talking to them, and they're going to be using it as like an aid to memory after. So rarely do you want to be writing entire novels on your impact statements. Good graphics tools. Here we go. So there are a lot of different ways to try to put these things together. As I mentioned earlier, I used Canva for all of the templates that are in the toolkit that I mentioned you can download. So Canva is really great because it has several different levels. There's a lot you can access that's completely free. Then it has the option to like buy a single image or a single template, or there's a subscription model. So whatever your kind of budget or comfort level or time, et cetera, commitments are for making these kinds of things, Canva is very flexible, and that's really nice. Sometimes it can be really frustrating if you're looking for like the exact perfect image, but it also gives you the opportunity to upload your own. So again, very, very flexible. Some of these other ones are also good at other kinds of infographic creating. Pictochart, PicMonkey, Venngage. I would recommend Buffer has a review list of 12 infographic makers, and they say like, this is good for doing this. This is good for doing that. If you want to make a Venn diagram, do this. If you want to be able to create these kinds of charts, use that. That is one of the drawbacks to Canva. Like most of their individual little graphics are only moderately editable. So like you cannot actually take a bunch of information and make a pie chart in Canva. So that is not something it can do. If you've got a really simple, semi-standard kind of percentage, like half of our student population comes from your district, like they have pre-made little charts that show 50%, but you can't like tweak them very much aside from changing the colors. So I recommend playing around with them and figure out what it is that's the tool that will do the most of what it is that you're looking for. Oh, Amara says Canva can do editable pie charts. That's great. Learn something new every day. Thank you very much. And so, yeah. Now I'm going to have to go figure that out myself. Spreading the word. Brooke, did you want to get us started there?
Sorry, I was muted. Sure. Yeah. So there are lots of different ways to advocate. And as anyone will tell you who advocates, it's not just like a single day thing. It's something that you should really be thinking about and trying to do throughout the year. So an easy way to do that is to look into who represents your particular district that your museum lives in. And there's lots of resources, and I'm sure Meg has gone over it before about how to find that information out. You can send an email introduction to those folks. You can invite them to your museum, maybe to a particular program that you're doing that you think might be interesting. When you're going up, whether it's nationally or locally, to the offices of your congressional representatives, you can think about what types of information that you want to leave behind. All of these templates are really useful resources for them to refer back to after you've visited, and think about if there's additional information that is connected to your sorry, I just got caught in the chat there. It's connected to your organization that might be useful for them to have. As I mentioned earlier, you're often visiting with congressional aides, not actually with your senators or representatives because they're super busy. And so that leave behind material can be helpful for them as a resource when they're going back to talk to their supervisors. Other thoughts, Meg?
Yeah, so at 11 o'clock, we're going to be going into a real deep dive on how to be able to use some of this information that you've collected for your impact statement and all these snazzy infographics you've collected and turn around and use them for social media. So I won't go into that majorly in depth now, but for those of you who are not joining us at 11, you can be taking pieces of your impact statement, particularly the pieces that are directed at a general audience, and be using them for social media awareness campaigns for your members or the general public. You can also be tweeting them directly at your elected officials. You can be using them to contribute to a conversation that's ongoing in, say, a relevant hashtag like green museums, if you're talking about environmental impact, things like that. Some of your local politicians may have essentially kind of a location political hashtag. In Massachusetts, there's MAPOLI, MAPOLI, and a lot of people will tag things about what's going on politically in Massachusetts with that, so that you can be using tags like that to get seen by people who are interested in public policy, et cetera. So, and again, if you weren't seeing people in person, or even if you were, you can always send this kind of thing in a follow-up email, especially if people were asking you for further information about something. You can be including that leave behind information. You can be taking snippets out of these impact statements to be used for other purposes too, as I mentioned before. So you can be putting some of these infographics in some of your member communications if it's important, especially if it has an impact on things like funding appeal that you're doing for a particular project or program. You can be using it with your granting organizations and your donors. You can be using it with the general media as part of your media packets and PR outreach and that sort of thing as well. So once you've created these, they can be very elastic depending on what kind of an audience you're looking to share them with. Thank you, Heather, for putting the sign up for the 11 o'clock session in the chat. And people have been putting amazing stuff in the chat. So we will collect all these links and mail them back out to everyone who was registered for today. So please don't worry that you're going to be losing everything when the program ends. So we will collect all that and send it back out to people. All right, at this point, we have many minutes left for questions. And I realize that A, I at least talk very fast, and B, we threw a lot of information at you. So does anybody have any questions or want us to go back over something we may have touched on too lightly as we were going through, et cetera? Please feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to stop sharing so that people, but before I do, New England Museum Week. Take all of your brand new advocacy skills, and some of you I'm sure are doing Museums Advocacy Day with AAM in a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks after that, we're rolling into New England Museum Week. Please feel free to sign up and join us for that as well. All right, so yes, please feel free to raise your hand either just on screen or using the hand raise option, or type into the chat if you've got any questions. I think we've been answering the questions that have come up in the chat so far.
And I'll also just throw in, I put in the chat the link to the Congress Foundation on communicating with Congress. They have a lot of really good resources and tips, I'm sure a lot of which Meg went over yesterday in the NEMA session, but that's another good resource to kind of prepare you for going up to Congress, whether it's
True, there's a lot of good information out there, and we have some links to some of the basics of advocating and getting involved in our advocacy resource library as well. So Nonprofit Vote has some great resources, for instance, and they have some state-based chapters as well with more local information about what's coming up with, say, gubernatorial elections and midterms, et cetera.
Meg, it looked like there was a question in the chat about persuading marketing teams. Do you see that?
Ah, okay. Suggestions for persuading your marketing team on the value of creating impact statements that don't lead to direct ticket sales. Okay, sure. Well, the fact that impact statements are multi-purpose helps, right? Because you can create them once and then only have to do tiny tweaks for a season until you need to update the information again. So the fact that they can be used for grant reports, like I would get whoever your fundraising and like membership people are on board with you to help talk to marketing about sort of it being useful to multiple elements. I think the fact that you can be using these to convey the importance of some of what you're doing as a staff to your board can also be really helpful. So if you're pitching it as being a board communications tool, that can sometimes be helpful for persuading your team. And then, if you have the bandwidth, the spoons, however you want to put it, to be able to create a bunch of the content yourself and then present it to them and say, here's what I've got, would you like to make it pretty? if you've taken most of the work out of it for them, they might be more willing to do it. Depending on what size of an organization you're at, I know there are different levels of bureaucracy around branding and who's allowed to create what and how many levels of approval it needs to go through. I have worked at both very tiny organizations and very large ones. So I went from being sort of the person who did all of the graphic design to having to just write things and then hand it off to someone else and say, enjoy. So I know that can be difficult.
Yeah, I would just second that. I think they're external advocacy tools, but they can also be internal advocacy tools. And so remembering that and using that potential argument point with your marketing team could be helpful.
Yeah. All right. And John's got a question about, shouldn't all impact statements be multi-purpose? And I'm not entirely sure whether your question, John, is whether education, economic equity, and environmental should all go into one impact statement, or whether all of those impact statements should be flexible and usable for multiple audiences.
Yeah, I'm thinking all. I think they should be, I guess I'm having trouble with separating out impact statements, I guess. I mean, it seems like maybe that's because I'm thinking at it from a small perspective. From a small organization.
There are certainly some examples where people have combined, say, economic and educational. There are some examples of that on the AAM site, for instance. I think the reason to pull them out separately has to do with what kind of a conversation you're trying to have and what kind of an ask you're trying to make. So if you specifically are looking for support on something that is environmentally related, then it is worthwhile calling that out as its own thing. You know, I would say as a general rule, people are mostly asking government for financial support of some sort. And most people mostly expect that museums are part of what they call the creative economy or the tourist economy, and that museums are educational institutions. So they expect to see information about what your economic and educational impact are. But where it's relevant, and you want to be having a conversation about these other topics, then it is worth creating material specifically about that. Because again, if you're trying to smush it all into one impact statement, it's going to get really crowded. And you run the risk of people just not taking any of it in because it's too much stuff on one or two sheets of paper.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say, go back to your communication goals. So what do you want to get across to these people that you're talking about, or what is your ask or your need? And then thinking about how your impact statement can address that, but definitely seconding Meg's point, like do not cram everything onto one, because it's just going to be hard for people to read and to absorb it.
Yeah, and not all of these are going to be equally relevant to your organization at any given time. So, these are examples to get you started. It's not a requirement that you do any or all of them. We obviously highly recommend that you do at least one in order to help you tell your story better. There are a lot of reasons to create an impact statement. And I think I didn't explicitly say that it can make you look a lot more professional when you're in a meeting, to be able to have something to hand over that says, here's who we are and here's what we need from you. It makes you really look prepared and like you know what you're doing. It's not a requirement, but it's definitely helpful. All right. Any other questions? Got a few more minutes. And I apologize to anyone who's feeling blasted between the ears, because I know this was a lot, but I'm hoping at least some of it has been interesting and informational. And if any of you do create an impact statement, I would love it if you would email it to me so I can see what you've been up to. And if you're willing to give us permission to add it to our own resource center so that people can see some examples of what other museums have been up to, that would be great. I would love that. One of the things I did not mention during design was you probably want to make sure that whatever material you're creating does line up with your institutional branding. So, the templates that I created, we tried to offer up a variety of layouts and possibilities and whatever, but you want to make sure that you're following whatever it is that actually works for your organization, so that you're following your kind of public identity as well.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree. I think it can be a little overwhelming, and we certainly shared a lot of information. But, you know, thinking about just where you want to start, like you can just start with one. If education is kind of what you want to get across to people, then start there and think about how, you know, you can really make that interesting and engaging, and then you can build on that over time. You certainly don't, as Meg said, have to do all four. And you can just think about what your goal is and what you want to get across, and start there.
And in the meantime, we also have some regional sheets for those of you who are in New England that are already created that you can download and use. For instance, we've got one on climate impact in museums that you are more than welcome to just download and use. Talks about what some of the specific climate impacts on museums in New England have been in the last few years, and what we're looking at for potential difficulties, and also some of the ways that New England museums are being leaders in climate change education, et cetera. And so that's just a general fact sheet that exists that you are welcome to use. One or two final notes, one of which is that we already talked about New England Museum Week. Please feel free to sign up for that. Another is that we are interested in expanding our advocacy committee from staff and board members to include some folks who are not currently on our board. So if you are interested in helping NEMA plan further advocacy activities, toolkits, et cetera, please be in touch with me and let me know, and I can talk to you about what that might look like. And I forget what my third thing was. Thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful day.
A good one. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you all. Go forth and advocate.
That's right. I'll hang out here for 1 or 2 more minutes in case anybody else has questions. Thanks again, Amris.
See you soon. I'm having my communications manager come to the next one. It's right in our normal weekly meeting. I was like, let's go to this instead. So
Perfect.
See you soon.
Bye.
Brooke, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hope that was clear.